that language, such as its interpreters, compilers, commands, code editors, and so on. All of this is done to familiarize them with the basic concepts of what writing software entails. But once you've gotten past the barrier of simply writing code and you know what an if, a loop, or a function are, and you understand the basics of a programming language, the next thing you need to do is create software that actually solves a problem. Because writing code is like learning a new language. It's not enough to know the basics of a language. You have to use it, you have to write something, you have to read something, or use it to communicate. In other words, knowing how to write code isn't enough. You also need to understand how it works. In software systems, protocols, architectures, design guides and patterns and many other topics that every programmer should learn in order to overcome the barrier of being just a programmer who writes code for the sake of writing to one who is truly competent in creating software. And in fact, this is the difference between a software developer who is just starting out and one who has been in the sector for a long time, because the latter has already become familiar with many of these terms or concepts and understands them in a practical way, and one who only knows a few programming languages or a specific tool and who has difficulty creating a solution. If you are just starting out, don't worry. Sooner or later, if you keep studying, you will reach that point. But in this video I would like to share with you a premise that helps me to master many more languages and frameworks in a way that is very simple and in fact quite obvious, but that many ignore, and that is the premise. Understanding concepts is much more important than just learning code. Coders, I am always looking for tools and resources to improve my English, especially in the context of programming, to try to sound more like a native speaker. And one platform that I use for this is Inigo, which helps me improve my English by allowing me to practice my speaking constantly, in addition to getting classes and help from native coaches. It also has an AI tool that not only corrects but also suggests changing your phrases for more eloquent and native phrases. And the classes are not limited to teaching you typical English sentences, but they teach you phrases that you can use in real life when presenting a project, when talking to your boss or foreign clients, or when you want to write English like a native. Inigo is certified by the British Council, which guarantees that you get a quality English education. In addition, here you can find many programmers from all over the world and generate contacts. Personally, it not only helps me improve my vocabulary and correct phrases, but it also helps me with fluency so that I can communicate with my clients like a native. So if you are a programmer looking to improve your English, I definitely recommend you try Migo. Get a 90% discount on your monthly or annual plan with the link in the description. On this channel, you've seen me using several programming languages and frameworks based on these languages, which are even useful for different types of projects. Some are used to create back-end codes, others front-end, mobile, desktop applications, or web applications. And sometimes, many of you ask me, how is it that I can learn all these tools and languages, or how can I change them so frequently? The answer can be very simple. Many of these languages, frameworks, SDC, and tools in general, are very similar or almost the same. To help you understand it, think about this. If you learn what a conditional is in one programming language, when you learn another, it won't take you much time because it's the same, except that its syntax varies. Some have braces, others just a space, others just parentheses, but a conditional in any language will do the same thing. In other words, if you think about it a little, that means you've understood an idea before just memorizing code. This is what I mean by the idea that concepts are much bigger than just learning code. You understand what a conditional is, not what an if is in some language, and this applies to everything. In other words, if you understand what a function, a class, or an instance is, it doesn't matter in which language you apply it. Only its syntax will vary. It will continue to be the same in concept. And I'm not just talking about code, because if you understand the definition of what an interpreter is in a runtime environment or what a compiler or transpiler is, it won't matter in which language you use it, because you understand the final output that those programs in that language will give you. So this also helps you understand multiple software tools, or it also applies to cloud services, where many of these also have concepts that are divided into categories. So if you learn the definition of what a BPS is, it doesn't matter if you use it in AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure, they all offer the same thing. That also applies to the front end. If you know what server-side rendering, click-side rendering, or static-side generation is, it doesn't matter what framework you use, because when new frameworks come out in the future, you'll be able to know what they ultimately do and you'll be able to understand whether you should really use them or if you should learn them. Again, if you understand the concepts before the code, tools, and services, you'll understand how to easily switch between them. Now, I know this might seem like a problem for programmers who are just starting out, but I've actually seen it in people who have been programming for years, because this isn't about programming. It's much more related to a learning process related to code, or in other words, knowing the theory helps. Within everything you use as a developer, everything has a classification, and understanding how your tools, services, languages, and general concepts of your favorite language are classified will help you not just write code for the sake of writing, but also understand that it's just one part of everything you use. That's why I often mention that the language doesn't matter when you look at things this way, because they're just tools, some of which help you do a better job or some help you finish in less time. Languages, in my opinion, are like a programmer with their toolkit. In other words, depending on the problem you're faced with, you choose one tool or another. Sometimes a mechanic chooses a wrench, sometimes a hammer, sometimes a screwdriver, and so on. To solve a problem that a software developer has, they do the same. Sometimes it's better to use an easy-to-read language like Go instead of C++ for the back end. Other times it's better to use a single language for everything, like JavaScript, rather than going for a full-stack environment. Other times it's better to use a cloud language that stores objects instead of storing files locally if you're going to serve them globally. You will make all these decisions as long as you first understand what each of these services, tools, and so on are about, or rather, when you first understand the concepts, which will lead you to have to do some research before starting to use something or simply choosing for the sake of choosing. And this is key because in the end it will allow you to think about developing systems instead of just thinking about individual tools. You will see how to put these pieces together to create complex software, which will make you more competent and even more interesting and easier. It becomes interesting because it doesn't matter if tomorrow you are offered a job in a language that you may not be very familiar with because you may have already worked with a similar one and the ideas can be transferred from one language to another, which makes it much easier for you to not have so many problems learning it while you are working on a project. And in fact, this is the next point I am going to talk about, how to put all these ideas into practice. You might be wondering if there's a course or tutorial on this, but there really isn't, because each developer needs to learn this differently. However, there is a way you can do it in a fun way, and that's by continually creating projects. Now, I'm not talking about always creating the same project, but rather increasing the difficulty as you learn. For example, if you're starting to program and you've already created a terminal application that asks you something, level it up and create some kind of CRUD with a graphical interface. Now that you've done that, add a database. Now that you've done that, add an API. Now that you've done that, add authentication, add deployment, add SMS sending, notifications, and email sending. Now that you've done that, automate the deployment with infrastructure as code tools. Now that you've done that, add monitoring. Now that you've done that, create a much more complex architecture with microservices or micro front ends, and so on. There's no end to this. That is to say, the first step is to set a goal, in this case an application or a final project, and start increasing the difficulty as each one of these is solved. The next thing, once your goal is set, is to design a bit of the application architecture. It sounds like something complicated, but in reality you can start with very simple graphics, drawing all the parts that interact. You can draw boxes that represent a client and a server, a line that represents a protocol, the cloud services that you are going to use or the programs or the interpreter that you are going to execute. In other words, you must outline a general idea of what it is going to entail to do a project. I do this in both large and small projects. It helps you to have an overview of everything, although it is not the only way, because if you develop a database, you can also create an RD diagram and there you first define your data models, which also gives you an idea of how a project is going to be developed. But again, all of this is theoretical so that before writing code you already have at least an idea of all the parts that go into the system you are creating. Once you have developed graphics or drawings to get a general idea, now you have to start developing your project. For this you can use GPT, Copilot or any other tool you like. The idea is no longer just to write code, it is to carry out the design you have created. And in fact, it seems as simple as it sounds, but it takes time because within these topics, there are subtopics and these subtopics in turn have more and so on. This means that even though you can create a very simple project, you will learn more and more services as you create it. This has happened to me when I have had some developers who have proposed a basic project and as we have developed it, more and more services or more tools and languages have been needed and in the end a project that started out very simple ends up being much more complex than it seemed. Okay, once you have created the project, what you could do is replace parts of that design. That is, if you have already created an RS API for a project, change it for Graphel or TRPC or WebSockets, which would give you an idea that you are learning many technologies related to RPC or remote procedure calls, which is a communication paradigm that we usually use and that if you use applications such as Twitter or Facebook, you use it very frequently. Or if you used SQL Server for your database, you can also learn from others by changing them, such as SQL Server, MariaDB or MySQL, and you will notice how there are some small variations, but it will be much easier for you to understand some of the differences between them. What's more, if tomorrow you are given a new SQL database, you won't have any problems because you already know most of what you have worked on in these projects. Or if you use a cloud service to send emails, change it for another one and learn the name of the category of these services that send emails. For example, they are called transactional email services. So, tomorrow when you need to modify it, you just search for some type of service and you will find a huge list of options. Or if you have already deployed a VPS, which is classified as an infrastructure as service, you can also now deploy it in a step, in a platform as service, or maybe you just want to create a function serves. In other words, these terms that seem complicated have a meaning. You have to have an idea or at least a basic notion of what they are about so that when you have to start using them it will not be something complicated to understand. And by changing each part of a system that you have already created, this gives you an idea that they all do the same thing, but in a different way. And as you create projects or replace parts or learn about new tools, you also learn about their difficulties and considerations when developing a project. In the middle of the day when it helps developers to carry out projects, many times this has been noticed as projects made in Python look a lot like those in Node 10 or how using a SprintBot framework is similar to creating a project in NES, and not because of the syntax, but because of the architecture, the way in which the code is created, because it also generates code. Those frameworks also have dependency injection or because they also follow network principles and can easily transfer what they already know from one framework to another. And again, the idea is the same. It is because they have truly understood what their tool does and have not just learned the tool. So, in order to achieve all this you must be clear about the following. First, study what the tool you are studying is about, how it works. At least give yourself a superficial idea so that you have a basic notion. Do not just use it. Take notes because memory is fragile, for that you have tools like Notion or Obsidian and write down what each tool does or what each service does. Write down the terms that are complicated for you and eventually when you hear one of those terms again, you have already written it down and written down what it is about in your own words. In other words, if you have created an application in the cloud, do not just ask the chat to solve a task for you or give you a tutorial on how to generate or deploy an application. Understand a little about those tools and what other options you have or how they are classified or how they work so that you can later replace them and gain a skill that the chat will not give you, which is to truly understand what you are doing. Pay attention to those strange terms that it mentions and study them a little. Know what a BPS is, a BPC, a proxy server, an object storage service, a transactional email service, an infrastructure as code service, a no-code service. All of these terms ultimately encompass a huge number of tools tools, and if you simply learn one category, you are learning many tools underneath, or at least you have an idea of what many tools underneath do. All of these are terms that categorize many services, so if a new service comes out tomorrow, you simply have to see which category it fits into, and with that you would already have an idea of what it does. And in fact, these topics go on, so the important thing is that you constantly study all of these theoretical things so that eventually when you write code,